Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the San Francisco Public Library. Thanks for turning out this afternoon. I'm John Smalley, a librarian in the Humanities Center here in the main library. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge our community and to tell you about a couple upcoming events. On behalf of the Public Library, we wish to welcome you to the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as caretakers of this place. As guests, we who reside and work in their traditional territory recognize that we benefit from living and working here in their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. As some of you probably know, today's program is part of the library's Everybody's Climate series, a program series that we hope will inspire you to act for a safer, greener, and more sustainable future. I'd like to mention a couple of our programs later this week. On Thursday at noon, we'll be screening two short climate documentaries, Climate Crisis Drought and Food for Change. So these documentaries look at some extreme droughts that have affected China in recent years and hundreds of millions of people. And also the second film, Food for Change, looks at efforts to transition to a different dietary model as a way of fighting climate change. Thursday evening, also in this room, the films will be in the carrette across the way. In the evening, we will have a multimedia performance, The Jingwei Bird. This will feature music by the acclaimed Del Sol String Quartet, featuring new music by Asian composers, and we will also have poetry performed by San Francisco's poet laureate, Jenny Lim. So I hope you'll come back for that. That should be a joyful way to conclude a month of climate programs. If you want to find out about the remaining programs, you can check the website, sfpl.org/everybody'sclimate, or you can pick up one of the blue booklets on the coffee table to your right, where you will also find coffee and cookies. There's, help yourself, there's also a QR code above the table. If you wouldn't mind, before you leave today, use the QR code to give us feedback about today's program. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So now, before turning the microphone over to our today's presenter, I would just like to say a few words of introduction. Jason M. Wirth is chair and professor of philosophy at the University of Seattle. His areas of specialization include environmental philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, and philosophy of art. His many excellent books include Rivers, Mountains, and the Great Earth, reading Gary Snyder and Dōgen in an age of ecological crisis, Nietzsche and Other Buddhists, Philosophy After Comparative Philosophy, and the practice of the wild, Schelling's Practice of the Wild, Time, Art, Imagination. He's written many others, and they're all good. Jason is a marvelous writer, also a wonderful speaker and a good friend. Please give a warm welcome to Jason Wirth.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for spending a little bit of your afternoon with me. I'd like to begin by just saying what I hope would be obvious about the title, Humanity in the Anthropocene. I could give that a very derivative reading, like, oh, we're humans, we're in the Anthropocene, that can't be good, can you tell me more? Well, that's already very discoverable, it's already out there, the news is not good. I think that's not really a mature thought. And so I would point just, since English has, although it's a Germanic language, is heavily inflected by Latin and Greek, given our history, some ways good, some ways bad, it's a little bit of a linguistic bow to the language we're now speaking, because it's Latinate and then a Greek resonance that is still with us today. Humanitas, of course Latin, the word for human, anthropos, the Greek more or less equivalent. So in a way, you could say the Anthropocene is the age of humanity. At the same time, John has mentioned that he's in the humanities division here. I teach philosophy at Schelling University. That's one of the humanities. We cry all the time. The humanities are under siege. STEM is going to crush us all. There's no oxygen left for us. What will life be without the humanities? And I think those are very legitimate concerns. I share them. I share the sadness of that historic burden. But I'm not here to say that also, because you either agree with me and we're done. I want to hear already something problematic in the word humanities. And we can hear it as problematic because when we just drop out of Latin back into Greek, we can say we live in the age of the humanities, the age of humanity, the Anthropocene. And suddenly we go, wow, that was not going so well. I'll just say a couple very basic things in the beginning. I suspect for most of you this will be the most boring part, but I just want to be very clear that the Anthropocene is a term that we all can use comfortably. This is a term that's part of everyone's active vocabulary every day. Everyone's like, oh yeah, oh man, Anthropocene can't be good. Yes, no, do I have any sense? I'll just review it just slightly. It is a word of very recent coinage, going back to about a quarter century ago. The term comes from geology and the debate within geology, and it's going back and forth. Are we geologically in the time of the Anthropocene, or are we still where we thought we were and where most of us were born, which was the Holocene? Is the Holocene giving rise to the Anthropocene? And that would be that anthropogenic activity is so profound that not only is it uncomfortable for us and the many other forms of life with whom we share our own lives, it is a geological event, and it is changing the very geological character of the Earth. So not just bad for us, big enough to change how it all works. And the cause of that is, and again, anthropos, it's kind of left open a little bit. What do we mean exactly by anthropos, by human? It's a hard thing. My leftist friends will always say, you can't blame poor people. They're anthropos also, but you know, Bangladesh is not doing this. You know, the United States is doing this. Do you mean the Capitalocene or the Petrocene or the 1%ocene? Yeah, of course, all those things. So I'm very aware of those things. But I want to go also, not just to rehearse those well-known talking points, which I'm very sympathetic, but also try to tease out what we might mean by the Anthropocene in terms of the humanities. What other things is it giving rise for in terms of how we might think about things? The Holocene, as you know, that's again a term of Greek origin, holos, new. The Holocene was a whole new age. So as the great glaciers began to recede, it was a time extremely good for our species and many of the other species with whom we share our lives, because it was a time of relative climate stability. And so the easy thing to see about the Anthropocene is, wow, the Holocene. Yet, okay, it does remind us we're all earthlings. That's true. Elon Musk trying to say he'll save humanity by sending 3 or 4 of us to Mars is really not a realistic plan. I get all that. And it is true that we are earthlings. It is true that as we think about what's happening right now, we're reversing Galileo's thought. Remember, Galileo's great thought was, we're just a planet among planets. Don't take yourself so seriously. And that's really deep. We're just a planet among planets. It turns out a planet among billions of planets, uncountably large and unimaginable number of planets. It's also true that of all those planets, this is the only planet in which our life is possible. So in a way, by stressing too much of Galileo, not in order to then give a nod to the church, I think, was obviously misguided in its reasons for rejecting Galileo, but we should remember also that we are earthlings, only the earth. But we should also remember that in the 4.5 billion years of the earth, we are the Holocene, 20,000 years of 4.5 billion. We're a geological second of the only planet in the imaginable universe in which we can be human. By human, I mean minimally this: alive. Whatever else we are, we're not it if we're all dead. Only this place, only this time. And this time was something brand new. So this strange event that we call humanity was a new thing in a new time, and it was newly stable. And this new thing at a new time is potentially so unstable that the newness will give rise to a new. And the new, the Anthropocene, so Holocene's done. It's the old new. We're right perhaps before the new, and the new is not going to preserve the other new, which is us. And the Anthropocene, it's a strange term because the age of the anthropos is the age in which what it means to be human, anthropos, is inseparable from the fact that we can, as many of my leftist friends say again and again, and of course they're absolutely right, none of my students disagree with this, it's easier to imagine the end of our species than it is to imagine an alternative to capitalism. I mean, I'm not even saying a right one. I mean, just even a dumb one. To say anything, to even have a debate about what the options might be. I'm not saying there's not people having those debates. I'm simply saying they're not culturally widespread, and they're, for most people, very difficult. Yet it's very easy to see that the new is the rise of the anthropos. And the anthropos's rise is simultaneously the anthropos's decline. To me, that's really interesting. So that's all in this term Anthropocene. I mean, it has the kind of granular problems of we don't mean all humans. It means, yes, Naomi Klein is right, that those least responsible for the Anthropocene will bear the heaviest burdens of the Anthropocene. So the poor, who have had very little to do with causing it, will be its first and most profound victims, minimally because they will have no material means in order to adapt. That's all true. But anthropos itself is showing itself in new ways, a new kind of a problem, a new way to think about what's going on. Okay, so that's my big kind of background thing. But I want to think about this term anthropos because when we think about being humane, where's your humanity? I ask that every day when I read the newspaper and look at anything coming from Washington, D.C. Where's the humanity? I think, wow, you're destroying poetry and classical music, you know. The humanities, you know, we're going to have what, AI? I mean, it's the most artificial thing would be that you would call that intelligence. Anyway, but I want to just kind of tie this back, this problem of humanity, because it is a kind of hot topic before the rise of the Anthropocene, when this was all unimaginable. And in the European-inflected West, I think the best way to enter the problem is to look at the most significant debate on this issue. So now we imagine, like I teach at the university, we're all running around post-human, we're all post-human, what does it mean to be post-human, and all these little things we like to say, and we're in the post-humanities. Dude, we're not in the post-humanities. We're not teaching anything. You know, but putting all that aside, you know, it's very fashionable. And it does come from someplace, and it has some insights, But those insights themselves are being given a new inflection as we think about who we are as a possibly geological event. And so I'm going to go back to, have you all read Jean-Paul Sartre? Is that anybody in this room? Anybody's like, oh, don't make me go through that again. Jean-Paul Sartre, good left bank intellectual, caffeinated, wrote long books. Very interesting person. He is associated with existentialism. Existentialism is broadly the following approach to thinking. Prior to the left bank intellectuals, we all thought that things were what they were because God made them that way. What's a human being? I don't know. Ask God what he meant. There's no God. Well, then whatever we are, it's not what we're meant to be because there's no meaning. There's no meaning. Life's not worth living. All these deeply ingrained habits of thought. And the existential is like, stop. Dare to think what we already know from science all the way through. No, the universe does not have something in mind. It's not a plan. It's not working things out. How things come to be what they are explained with much less drama. Evolution, contingencies, physics, all these sorts of things. So there's no great idea of what humanity is in the mind of God such that we're all examples of what God had in mind. Stop that thinking. And this was 1947. It was a weird time to be giving a lecture in Europe because Europe had just killed 60 million people. Wow, barbarism, if there ever was barbarism. People are really, really shaken. And sitting in the audience is Jean Beaufret. Jean Beaufret was also an early French Heidegger scholar. Heidegger, a name for anybody in this room besides John? Yeah, very famous. Also wrote very long books in German, so with longer words. This guy. And Jean Beaufret writes to Heidegger. Heidegger's also the other really famous person that people are associating with existentialism. He goes, dude, this stuff is scary. Is there any way we can redeem the word humanism, the root of the humanities? Because if there's no meaning beyond the human other than the meaning we give it, well, we can construct it however we want to construct it. This turns Sartre into a Marxist because we'll need the material conditions to construct it, not just in your head, but you have to actually make it possible in the world. But, it's up to us. We are what we make ourselves. Isn't that interesting? We are what we make ourselves. How's that look in the Anthropocene? What are we making ourselves? What's it revealing about something that we're not making as it forces us to look at our humanity in a non-optional way? But put that aside for now. Beaufret writes Heidegger this big, big concern. And Heidegger writes one of his most famous and most celebrated pieces. It's called The Letter on Humanism. And it's an extremely profound essay. Heidegger is still taken seriously all over the world for good reason. He was a deep dude. Even if you hate him, you got to admit the dude was deep. As Heidegger begins to think about this, and he looks at Beaufret, and Beaufret's like, man, humanism, it's evacuated. We're in that time of rising nihilism. We're just what we make ourselves. It's the beginning of post-humanism because there's no humans that we are. We're after that. We're just what we construct ourselves to be, or worse, what we are constructed to be, whether we want to be or not, by capitalism and all these other systemic sorts of things, our material conditions. And Heidegger responds first by tracing the origin of this word, human. And he does it now in the Latin. Now, if you've read Heidegger was a complete linguistic bigot. I mean, it's just insufferable, really, on one level. He thought there were only 3 proper philosophical languages: German, conveniently his language; Greek, the other language he was good at; and Sanskrit, a language about which he knew almost nothing. That was it. So for him to turn to Latin can't ever be good. He thought it was a feckless language, but this is where we get our first ideas of the human. And he's right about it, first of all. We need to go back and begin to think very deeply. But what Heidegger notices, how this word is constructed by the Romans. The Romans are concerned with the following problem. I mean, what does it really mean to be a noble human, an excellent human? I mean, to really rise above the rest. You'll notice the metaphor I'm using again. It's always a metaphor of elevation, lifting yourself up. You know, we begin one of the many morons in the world, but then we go to college and we read poetry and listen to classical music and listen to Wirth talk about things in San Francisco. And next thing you know, I'm just soaring up there. Whew. You know, below me is the barbaros, the barbaroi, you know, the barbarians, the inhumane, the not properly human. And the humanities is going to extol the virtues, the excellences, whether it be the bodies of knowledge and art, or whether it be the habits of being, the very things that allow us to lift ourselves above the rest and really be human. So for the tradition at the very root of the humanities is not, we're all born human, for better or for worse. What's that? I don't know. No, it's something that you're not born. You know, no one's born a human. You become human. You grow up. You know, Kant will say in the 18th century, you know, this is the age of enlightenment. And what is the age of enlightenment? The age of Mündigkeit, of maturity. You know, when some of us are going to grow up. You know, that not everything. You know, like there's a difference between someone running Buchenwald and someone writing, and Paul Celan writing Todesfuge, a profound. He's rising above that. And you rise above. For the Romans, you rise above the rest. It's interesting also that this is also related to the word humility. But humility for the Romans is not a good thing. Those are the meek. I'll get to that in a little bit. But you know, to really, really move to excellence. And Heidegger's going to say, Sartre is right. There's no one big idea about what makes us human. That's true. But that tradition does not set us up highly enough. So he takes the same metaphor. It's not elevated enough. Simply saying there's some essence or some idea that you either accord to or don't accord to is not enough. You really, really have to go into thought and receive the meaning of being and all these very Heideggerian thoughts. That's very interesting. And Heidegger also said, and it's very, you know, the tradition of humanism and the humanities has paradoxically meant that human beings can live everywhere because they're at home nowhere. That this tradition has left us unrooted. It's abstract. It's maybe too religious for some people, you know, and you can be religious in this sense. Wherever you are, you just have to have these beliefs. Those beliefs, like math, you know, same math in China as the United States. You can just do it anywhere, anytime. Not rooted, not grounded. And so we're entering a time in which humanism is also that we're at home nowhere, because we're unrooted. And that's interesting. That's part of, I think, the power of that letter is that insight. But you know, it's also got its limitations. I'd like to just intervene on Heidegger, because Heidegger, although he sees how homeless we are, and the tradition of the human is in crisis, we have no idea how to think about this. Are we just making it up? You know, if we no longer believe that we are what we are because God made us what we are, then what's up? We're lost, we're left, we're out in the wilderness. Heidegger's trying to root us by these extremely fancy pants, intellectual, philosophical ways that really no one's going to think, honestly. There's never going to be a Heideggerian movement on Earth because, no one can even spell his name, let alone think like that. But it's interesting that Heidegger's still trying to say we need to think of it more highly, get higher up. But I'd like to reflect just for a minute on what the word human means prior to its elevation in Roman culture and politics. What is the etymology of the word human? Humus, earth, the rooted. You are how you're rooted. And I'd like to read something here from somebody, because I want to try to be very rooted about this. I live in Seattle, so I'm going to read someone from my area, rooted in my area, who will speak about this both as a Cascadian, but also you can draw some general inferences from it. We don't all share the same roots, but to be human is to be rooted somewhere. We share that. So this is Tom J. Tom J. was a great artist, a sculptor, a painter, a friend of the indigenous, a good poet. Tom J. We are all earthborn, literally and figuratively. And the word human confirms this assertion. Our words human, humble, homage, all derive from the Latin humus, earth, soil, ground, region, country. A human is earthborn, shares the quality of humus. It is well to remember that to our ancestors, humus was local, and that humanity was born and arose from a specific locale, a place. The people over the hill might not be quite human, not because they were barbarians, not because they were less than us, but only in the sense of your local humus. Our language knows we are earthborn, even if we think we are heaven sent. So, first of all, I want to say this is kind of deep, because we can already begin to sense, before it flowers into the Anthropocene, that there is a kind of unrootedness in terms of our very sense of ourselves. Because our sense of ourselves were, as the language indicates, our rootedness. It had nothing to do with getting above our roots. Modernity is about getting above our roots. How is modernity about getting above our roots? Every ecological limit is not a borderline, it's a battle line. We will be able to outspend in our activity the metabolic rate of any place that made us possible, primarily through our use of energy, fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. We'll be able to grow indefinitely. Adam Smith will say, and no one will bat an eye, we've solved the problem of production. That means we can grow however we want. We've solved it. We've blown Adam Smith away by saying, the limits of any place are not our limits. We are our capacity to free ourselves from ourselves by freeing ourselves from the limits of wherever we are, through energy, through technology. Wow. The Romans wanted to soar. Roman soaring had nothing on us. They had to use laws and customs and a lot of violence. We have Elon Musk. We're right there. And it's interesting because as we soar higher and higher, and by we can begin to say, well, who is this we? Well, it is the global political economic community. We who live all of our local customs behind as we become first and foremost citizens of a globally shared economic system. That is more important than what is then reduced to folklore or tourist trinket activities. You know, our old way, our old rootedness is just something, you know, go to Hawaii and watch people dance hula because, you know, isn't that quaint as we get there on our airplanes. The locals all become that. And humanity itself has never been so human in the great Roman way, soaring higher and higher above even ourselves, let alone everything else. And of course, we figure, well, only we are smart enough to do that. Because, you know, intelligence that's uniquely human, and to be human then is to soar beyond any old quaint sense of our rooted humanity by being able to grow indefinitely. As a matter of fact, our entire economic system would collapse the second there was not constant growth. I thought the planet was finite. Oh, you idiot. We're too intelligent for that. So I got Robert Bringhurst up here. He's another Cascadian. Bringhurst is one of Canada's most celebrated poets. He's just not too far north from where I live on Quadra Island in British Columbia. And he takes up the issue of intelligence and the sense that somehow human beings know themselves as the uniquely intelligent. You know, we are the ones who have logos, as Aristotle says. We are the ones, we've got this going on. Monkeys, they can't burn fossil fuels. So here's Robert Bringhurst. In contrast to Heidegger, who knows we're homeless, and all he starts doing is saying, well, we need to be a shepherd of being and things like that. Well, I don't know. How about put your finger in the soil? Here's Bringhurst, Hand in Glove. This is a poem that he wrote about 4 months ago. But did you know some horses think and like to think, just like some humans? That some humans seems smaller and smaller these days. What they may think may never leave their heads. Well, at least they never write it down. But you can see them and feel their minds work as surely as they feel their forelegs move. Truth is, the world is filled with beauty and intelligence you'll never see, and that's the way it should be. That's what makes it what it is. Some horses think, some jays and ravens understand the mouth can be a hand, the beak a shovel, or a hammer or a glove. They grasp how well it fits the mind. They see how comfortably the mind fits into what it does, which gives the world more opportunities for talking to itself. More ways to think about the only thing it knows. Wrens singing, thrushes calling, cowbirds gurgling and bowing, and the nighthawks building their self-immolating bass drums from feathers and muscles and air, tree crickets lifting and strumming the cut glass covers of their wings in the reverberating leaves, beavers slapping open waters, and Socrates talking. Proof that, stupid though we are, intelligence is out there, in here, listening and looking, fishing, hunting, digging, wondering, and saying what it can. Bringhurst is also really quite the philosopher, quite grim on our prospects, really wants to get us to begin to see that, first of all, let's just take the following supposition. Not only is intelligence something that we have, but where do we find it? How do we have it? Well, it's in our head. That human beings are the measure or gauge of intelligence. I'm not sure how intelligent that is. Why are we the gauge? Why is the metaphor of intelligence simply things are intelligent because, oh, you know, we, soaring above everything, pay attention to nothing besides ourselves, except to the extent to which these things are for ourselves, appropriatable by ourselves, property for ourselves, extractable goods for ourselves, and we soar above them and say, well, if it's not like me, it's dumb. That's pretty dumb. You know, there's tons of books coming out newly. You'll find them all over this library, for example, about the intelligence of trees. Oh, do you mean like a tree doing calculus? No, I don't mean a tree doing calculus. Why would a tree do calculus? It's a tree. Well, then where is the tree thinking? Where's its brain? Well, the tree's not thinking. That's using yourself, imagining that thinking is something that you do individually. The tree's not thinking. The whole ecosystem is thinking. It's solving problems. It's communicating within itself. It's evolving. It's shedding off diseases. One of those may be us, the intelligent ones. The intelligence of the earth is intelligent enough to respond intelligently to the stupidity of what we imagine to be our intelligence. That's the case. That's the Anthropocene. Smarty pants humans. In a world of intelligence, imagining that we're supremely intelligent and being in no way perturbed by the fact that that looks like us staring down at our own imminent demise and still congratulating ourselves. Humans, neither exclusive nor elevated, but communal and grounded. If you have intelligence, it's because you have all the grounded things that make you at all possible. And all these other things share in your being, are of your being, and therefore they're making even the measure of human intelligence at all intelligible. A new book by Mark Taylor. Mark Taylor is an old guy like me, a little older than me. He's done with philosophy. He's done teaching. He's done with higher education, which means he's going to tell us what he really thinks, which means his books are suddenly very interesting. Mark Taylor. This also came out in February of this year. The word human derives from the word humus, which is the organic component of soil, formed by the decomposition of leaves and other plant material by microorganisms. Death and life are thoroughly entangled. Bound in a parasite guest host relationship, we are part of the earth, which is part of us. Though all life ends in death, not all death leads to life. First of all, I think, what is the Anthropocene? Yeah, all life ends in death. Not all death produces life. The Anthropocene, death that will produce very little life. I mean, the exact opposite is, look at the intelligence of an old-growth forest. If it weren't for death, there would be no life. There'd be no nurse logs. There'd be no soil to sustain even the elder trees. All that soil is what we're, in essence, burning up in our intelligence. All the biomass, all the millions and millions of years of death making possible life, in which we imagine is just there for us, for our lives. Oh, our lives like forever? Well, I don't know, maybe this generation or two or three more. Until it's all gone. Are we past peak oil? I don't know, probably. If not, soon to be. Oh, peak oil. Well, that's sustainable, right? Well, it is on geological scale. It'll be back. We'll contribute to it with our deaths, but it'll be millions of years. I hope you're patient. Okay, anyway. I promise I want to go back now to this word, humility. You know, that's a really interesting word, humilitas in Latin. I think the most interesting thing about it, because, the Romans hated it. One of the reasons why they hated it is because they didn't like the Christians. I understand that they had their reasons, but they didn't like them. But humilitas is the Latin word in not Roman Latin, but in Church Latin, to handle the word that we know in English as meek, as in The meek shall inherit the earth. Humility, close to humus, not elevating, not soaring, not trying to find a place to land because that is the only possibility of humanity. There is no humanity on Mars. There is no humanity in the atmosphere. We are not birds. We are not mosquitoes. Like all things grounded in our sustaining conditions. But that's interesting little accident of history. Only the grounded shall inherit the earth. Only those of the earth inherit the earth. All those who live in the air, good luck. That's the Anthropocene. That is death that produces very little life. And when shall we do this? The Holocene. The Holocene, an especially fertile period for death because of all the life that it produced. If we think of 65 million years ago and an asteroid or a comet or whatever it was that landed in the Yucatan Peninsula and destroyed almost instantaneously millions of years old regimes of life, gone within days, almost all of it gone within a small number of years. Over 90% of all forms of life known on Earth at that time are gone. Look at the world we have now. It'll find a way. But we have to ask ourselves, we who soar, we who rise above, we noble ones, we who are above our conditions, rather than trying to understand how are we our conditions. Are we the dinosaurs? Or are we the comet? Is our way of landing back on Earth the comet? And I would say in the Anthropocene, we suddenly see the humility of our humanity. That's what it is to be human in the Anthropocene. It is to try to look up at our own soaring as we try to find a way to be on Earth again before it's too late. And I just have one last little thought. Back to Heidegger. If you've read any Heidegger, if you just like the German language, it's a really awesome word in there. Freud is a big word for Freud also, the Unheimlichkeit. It's a really awesome word because there's no such word in German as Heimlichkeit. Only Unheimlichkeit. And the word, Unheim, when somebody's unheimlich, I would say the best translation I would use in the good Germanic English would be like uncanny. Canny is a very rare word, but uncanny, the loss of our canniness. It's things that should have been familiar or obvious, things that we should take for granted, suddenly seem strange and weird and off. Nothing seems quite right. And in the word Unheimlichkeit is a very Germanic word. It's almost exactly the same as our own Germanic word for it, Heim, home. Not being at home. The strangeness of human beings is that we are somehow imagining that we can learn to be at home in an uncanny or unheimlich way. How strange it is to be human, when the strangest thing is that our own Unheimlichkeit does not at all seem strange. But also the word Heim is very interesting because I want to go back again to the Greek. What is the Greek word for home? Oikos. Oh, oikos, that's so interesting. What words do we get at oikos? Well, I'll tell you two very important words, economy and ecology. How strange our economic sense. And of course, economy, the nomos, the customs or rules of the home. that our economy is so unheimlich, so unhomely, is the strangest thing of all. How strange that our economics does not at all appear strange to us, but it seems like the only possible one, the natural one, the one that we should all be following. And suddenly we see that we have a fundamental choice in our humanity between political economy, our universal homelessness, our utter ungroundedness, and the strange unstrangeness of how strangely we live, or ecology, a new discourse on our home. I would like to conclude by saying the humanities' gift to us now is to be able to pose the following question, absolutely decisive to intelligence, human and non-human, going forward in the Anthropocene. Are you a political economist, or are you a political ecologist? If you are a political ecologist, there is no economics and no politics not rooted in the oikos. No unhomely or unhoused or unhousable ways of living. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, for a very interesting talk. We have time for a short Q&A. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand and I will bring a microphone to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wirth, for your presentation.
Jason, please.
Yeah. What's that?
Jason, please.
Jason, okay. Can we imagine a soaring that also gets us back to being earthborn? In other words, is there a way to reconcile these two conflicting tendencies? One is to the Roman soaring or the modern soaring, but then gets us back to being kind of like recognizing that we're earthborn. Can we imagine what that would look like?
Yeah, so by soaring, I don't mean, I just saw, for example, last week, one of my favorite films, I watch it ritualistically every couple of years, Andrei Rublev, the opening scene when he gets in the little balloon, soars in the sky, and it's this magical, wonderful scene. So I don't mean like we should never take to the air, never imagine that we live among the birds, those sorts of things. I mean something very, very specific, which is that we imagine our humanity is soaring above something very specific, which is...
I didn't mean it like literally soaring. I meant it metaphorically soaring, like technology soaring, learning, the enlightenment soaring.
Yes.
That's what I meant.
Yes. So the problem isn't technology. The problem is what humans do with technology. I'm not going to blame technology. It's like, you know, I blame that gun for making itself and shooting itself. Yep. These things are as good as we are grounded enough, human enough to make them. But it does, this metaphor is giving us a very sobering model for what the task going forward is, which is coming back down. How are we going to come back down? We have no sense of the local any longer. The local is utterly abstract, folklorish, maybe purely scientific. That's very good, but it's not, doesn't have habits of being associated with it, doesn't have deep customs, doesn't have wisdom stories. We've thrown all this away as hopelessly backwards and mythological. We look at our poets as just a bunch of cheap entertainers. AI will do better. Not those who try to articulate and hold into language the wisdom of the land for all of her people, human and non-human. So getting back down to earth is hard. And there's one possible distraction on the way back down, because it is a crisis. I mean, Heidegger was right about this. We are experiencing homelessness globally for the first time in human history. And that is also itself not to be separated from the Anthropocene. But as we have no idea how to come back down, really, as we're just guessing, as we're trying to recover traditions that we hardly know how to read anymore, That's a perfect opportunity for someone to bisect the fall back down to earth in a very interesting way. We could simply say, make America great again. Double down on the fantasy. Double down on the fantasy. Make America great. You know, I mean, we should all aspire to live in white Disneyland where all animals are like mouses that speak human languages and ducks, and everyone's having fun and everything's great, and all problems are like sent off into the sewers where you can't see them at all. And so we become, at a time in which our fantastical sense of our humanity is being exposed globally for the first time, we just triple down on the fantasy.
Wouldn't it, this is my last point, and wouldn't it, like a reliable alternative energy source, solve a lot of issues?
It would help, but it wouldn't. I like how you frame it to solve a lot of issues, not all the issues, because one of the issues, of course, is growth. I mean, there's not an infinite supply of lithium, for example. You know, you can't say, well, if we get on solar power and use lithium batteries, that, well, the Earth isn't going to produce fossil fuels sustainably, but it loves producing lithium endlessly. It's an infinite supply, and it has no ecological toll. The problem also is growth. That we need to be able to think a real distinction between development, so all of us thinking about the things that we need for a sustainable level of flourishing, versus growth, which is imagining that we could simply switch energy sources and continue to live the ways in which we're living. That just shunts the problem maybe if more generations down the road. But green growth this is an awkward thing to have to say, but it's like saying, you know, I'm a promiscuous virgin. The problem is growth. That we can grow to the skies infinitely, rather than learn to live within our own means, and that will mean with appropriate forms of energy, but also more appropriately consumed. The rate of consumption is also what we have to talk about in terms of what it means to be human. What is a humane rate of energy consumption, not of fossil fuel consumption? That is becoming inhumane.
Question back here.
Why can't there be room for humility in a narrative where humanity also rises? Like we all have a lot of power now, not just for ourselves, but also for life in general. Like probably we're not more than a few generations away from a decision on what we want to do with spreading life beyond Earth, basically. And we could potentially do that in a very humble way, where there's this concept called directed panspermia, right? Where you just shoot primordial life off to as many habitable planets in our galaxy as possible, just to like expand the playground for evolution, but not for ourselves, but for other species. So, yeah, what do you think?
It's a very complicated question. There's certainly, and I think you would be the first to admit, there's a real danger in thinking like that, but there's also real opportunities in thinking like that. I mean, you are playing with fire when you start thinking about terms like that, but that doesn't mean, therefore, that if we think, for example, how we think about wilderness in the Capitalocene, wilderness, leave only footprints, take only photographs, don't live in it, you'll wreck it. Well, no. I mean, the Anthropocene means we fly above everything and wreck everything in so doing. Learning to live appropriately within our means, whether it be in Yosemite or in San Francisco, that's what we're not thinking. Because the real problem is how we think about power. And I'd say the modern sense of power runs something like this. If we are wealthy enough, that is, if we change the technological and material conditions of our life, we can do more or less what we want. So our sense of freedom is autonomy. The less restricted I am by my material conditions, the more I take my material conditions and put them to my beck and call through technology, the freer I can be, because the less burdened I am by those material conditions. They become emancipatory. And so our sense of freedom is self-determination, as in not being determined by one's ecological conditions, but rather being determined by one's ambitions. That is the modern project of freedom. Affluence will make possible self-determination. That is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the Earth's response to that. It's the response. There is not freedom in terms of mastering one's material conditions. Freedom is within one's material conditions. In a world in which more is never enough, we have to rethink freedom in terms of less being more. Now, does that mean then that we can't do extraordinary things with technology? We could be part of ecosystems in a way in which, like all members of an ecosystem, we contribute productively to it. We don't just leave things to themselves, and those are national parks, and then wreck everything else. First of all, that'll wreck the whole Earth, including the national parks long term. Can we be, once again, productive contributors to an ecosystem that's not about us, but we do our share, as do all forms of life? I hope so. I hope that strikes me as a better use of technology.
Jason, we were talking a moment ago about, can one imagine alternatives to the route that we're on? And I recall a conversation you and I had yesterday about David Graeber's book, The Dawn of Everything. And any thoughts on that? That's a book we have at the library. Two sort of anarchist anthropologists do a survey of civilizations over thousands of years, looking at such things as the advent of agriculture and various different models of political and economic organization on different continents over vast stretches of time.
Yeah. If you haven't read that book, read that book. If you haven't read everything by David Graeber, get to work. They're all good. Very thoughtful person. I read David Graeber as the Kropotkin of our time, so the communal anarchist. The word anarchism is a very dangerous word to use because you spend all your time just taking it away from common parlance, where it's just a synonym with chaos, when it is a theory of order. And the order behind anarchy is much more closely seen in something like an ecosystem. The authority is non-centralized, widely dispersed, and time and task specific. So in the text that John referred to, it began as a study of the origins of inequality, kind of Rousseau-like. And they realized that's not the issue. We're too caught up in the modern lore. As they begin to study, and to get this from Kropotkin, what Kropotkin would show is not, there's all these societies that had us all figured out, and look at us, big dummies. No, that's not that at all. We live in a society in which we have no choice but to live like how we live right now. I know it's a big price. I know we'll wreck everything. I know we're destroying the earth, but we have no choice. We could live no other way. Everything else is not practical. And all we have to do is show there's tons of evidence in which other ways of living were possible. Not easy, not change overnight. And you show that what we imagine to be a necessity is just a contingency. It can be that way. That's why it is that way. But it doesn't have to be that way. And you better justify the price that we're paying for being this way when we don't have to be this way. You're going to have to give us better reasons for living like we live. But that's how Kropotkin thought, and that's how Graeber and his compatriots think. And as you begin to look at these counterexamples, which their only logical force that they need to do is this to show that a necessity is a contingency. So a lot of times you're being speculative about how we lived, et cetera, but the evidence begins to mount up that we did not always have to live the way we live, and we need to come up with a better reason for living the way we live, given the price that we can see that we're paying for it, and the fact that there's no evidence that it's necessary. You're just telling us it's necessary. As we begin to look at models that were more sustainable, because you should also keep in mind that a global empire of capital, has, at a global scale, empire, and it is true that no empire is long-lived. 0. So we'll do it at the grandest scale, the most complicated way imaginable, and that'll be the exception. And by the way, did I tell you we're the only intelligent people out there? At one level, you have to say, the Anthropocene is also a time for us to just get up and smell the coffee and go, wow, I have been living in an insane asylum. This is actually incredibly crazy how we imagine that what we're doing is thinking. It's a suicide pact. That's where we are. And as they looked and said, well, it was just a bunch of powerful people forcing their will on powerless people, that has happened. But the real problem was, what's the anarchist theory of authority? The example I would give would be the head librarian in this building. They have authority over the library. When do they have authority over the library? When the library is open. It ends at 5 o'clock. They can't show up at your house and say, I'm the head librarian, move over, I'm taking your spouse. I have this power. I'm calling ICE on you. The library can't call ICE on people checking out books. It's task-specific and season-specific. How do we get from putting someone in charge of the books to someone who has power over everything all the time and telling us this is the only way it can be? And then say, well, what's the price we're going to pay for this being the only way it can be? Well, a suicide pact. Why can't we also see the problem of the Anthropocene is we can also begin to see that historically, economically, and politically, that we are also living in times of extraordinary domination and trauma at a global level. A community based on wreckage, not on mutual advantage and mutual aid. And I think this is hidden in this little innocent word Anthropocene. You begin to see, start unpacking it. What sorts of thought is it beginning to make possible as we look at the legacy of our cultural, political, and economic decisions? I think they're interesting. Now, does that mean everything I'm saying is right? No, I hope you're just going to lie in bed at night hating me. But look, we're talking. We're talking.
So, Jason, I have another question to spring on you. So you bring up Heidegger, and he wrote this famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, where he talks a little bit about this tendency of humans to approach nature as if it's, how would you call it? He calls it in framing, as if it is ready for you to just do with whatever you wish. It's kind of like a stockpile of materials. But at the same time, which is a very dangerous attitude to have, as you have explained to us in your talk. But he also mentions, he quotes the poet Hölderlin, that at the same time, a saving power is growing, that there may be some countervailing tendency growing side by side. Do you see any such countervailing movement if we accept Heidegger's characterization of our age?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Heidegger is he's indispensable. He's also insufferable. I think both are true. To be fair, I can say this, I'm in my 60s. You'll learn a lot from Heidegger. His sense of the problem is really deep. He's also, and I say this as someone who studied in Germany, I love German culture, I love the German philosophical tradition. He's also way too German. And the German problem, of course, is just so hopelessly grandiose and not grounded at all. Slow it down. I mean, what do you mean? Oh, I mean, I can't pay my rent. Yes, but you're a shepherd of being. Oh, stop. Stop this kind of thinking. But really, honestly, it's part of what we need to talk about. How are we going to get from here to there? I mean, my library book is due today. I can't afford bus fare. What am I going to do? I mean, and that's also what we need to be thinking about. That being said, part of Heidegger's genius is, number one, to say the problem of technology has nothing to do with the existence of tools. That's like blaming the gun for shooting you. Chemical weapons are not inventing themselves and attacking us. We innocent, virtuous people. Problem of technology has nothing to do with the tools themselves, but rather how we think about them. And how do we think about tools? We think about tools in a way that tools help us from really not having to think about ourselves at all. We can't see that it's just me and my will and my ambition and my domination that I am using tools to have. That's really, it's blinding me to that. It's blinding me to what's stacked into my subjective position. That's what we can't see. And so the age of technology is not when we use tools. The age of technology is a time of unbelievable non-thought, when we can't think that we no longer think. Now, I want to say, on one level, yeah, that's a very important thing for us to contemplate. In a time in which we can't think that we can't think, dwelling in there is the most dangerous thought of all, that one day we may think. That's the Anthropocene. Think about it.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you, Jason, for the talk. I just wanted to ask a follow-up for what you just said about technology. So, yeah, there is this conception of technology as a tool to which you bring your own value systems. But there's also this other narrative, people like Marshall McLuhan have written about this, where the medium is the message, right? And you see this a lot in our modern culture, where when Instagram became very, popular, when you go to a tourist site these days, everybody's clicking pictures, right? People aren't, living in the moment as much as they were.
Yes.
And the Twitterification of our language, where everything that is worth saying in 140 characters or less, things like that. And we've become very argumentative. So there's this question of, with technology, does the technology itself have an implicit value system that is kind of subtly shapes the value system of the user? So is that a two-way relationship, or do you think those two are in isolation? And if it is a two-way relationship, then can you bring this groundedness to a technology that you design?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And by two-sidedness, I don't mean that it's fully transferable. It goes easily both ways. But I do think that there's real feedback loops. So the tool is not asking us to do anything. But as the tool hides me from my own non-thought, as it allows me simply to hold sway with my will, the tool itself should be stronger, more powerful, and it begins to go back, just like you see feedback loops in climate change. The sun is hot, it melts the ice. The more ice is melted, the more reflection off the ocean water, and the hotter it gets, which means more ice melts, which the hotter it gets, the more ice melts. It begins to go back like that. They begin to feed off of each other. And there are real feedback loops. And technology, once it gets going, of course, the feedback loop is going to make it more and more what it is. And so Heidegger did say one time something that got him in so much trouble, and I'm not going to defend it, and it's unacceptable in so many ways, but still it's so provocative that I'll just say there is one little shred that we should think about. Heidegger once thought that the Holocaust could not be separated from the mechanized food industry. The two were somehow connected. Now, he's not saying that feedlots and Auschwitz are the same. And if he was, that would be an insane thing to say. But there is something about the mechanization of genocide and our ecological collapse that cannot fully be disambiguated, and that it produces feedback loops. And the feedback loop is not starting with the tool, but there is in the mechanization of death in World War II and Twitter, if we dare think it, there is some connection. There is some connection. And that's welcome to the Anthropocene.
Thank you, Jason. Another round of applause for Jason Wirth.